On July 4, 2025, Washington, D.C. dazzled with patriotic spectacle. B-2 bombers overhead, fireworks over the Lincoln Memorial, crowds cheering beneath a sky of red, white, and blue. Yet behind the scenes, the president quietly signed another emergency spending bill. This time, not for progress, but to plug a deficit that had ballooned beyond all forecasts. The ink on that bill marked trillions in new debt, a silent admission of a nation living on borrowed time. America projected power in the sky, but its economic foundation was quietly eroding beneath its feet. The contradiction was stark, a celebration of independence, even as the country's reliance on foreign capital reached historic highs. The fireworks lit up the night but also cast long shadows, illuminating a path of fiscal unsustainability. The world watched, not just the spectacle, but the substance behind it, and began to draw its own conclusions. In the days after July 4th, the US dollar plunged fast, disorderly, and with a sense of global alarm. Unlike the controlled Nixon shock of 1971, this was no strategic move, but a sudden loss of trust, 1,000 small failures culminating in a crisis. Investors recoiled, questioning not just America's numbers, but its very solvency and political will. Today, alternatives to the dollar abound. Nations are building parallel systems, settling trade in local currencies, and reducing their exposure to U.S. risk. The dollar's decline is no longer a cyclical blip, but a structural shift, a geopolitical event. The world is no longer captive to a single financial order. The echoes of history are there, but the stakes are higher, and the sound is far more ominous. The dollar's fall is a symptom of a deeper global realignment. The dollar's dominance was built on trust in America's institutions, its fiscal discipline, and its willingness to honor its debts. That trust has eroded rapidly. Unfunded tax cuts, reckless spending, and political dysfunction have made U.S. fiscal policy a source of global risk. Foreign investors, once eager buyers of U.S. debt, are quietly stepping back, redirecting their capital elsewhere. Central banks in Asia and the Middle East are reducing their holdings, hedging against America's unpredictability. As foreign buyers retreat, the U.S. Treasury leans on domestic investors and the Federal Reserve, fueling inflation and further undermining the dollar. What was once a virtuous cycle is now a vicious one: capital flight, rising debt, and a weakening global order. The world's faith in America's fiscal stewardship is fading. The quicksand of uncertainty is pulling the dollar and global stability down. Trump-era policies promised a revival: tax cuts for corporations, tariffs to protect American jobs. The reality: tax cuts fueled stock buybacks and enriched the wealthy, while tariffs raised costs for businesses and consumers. The promised manufacturing boom never arrived. Instead, asset owners thrived, while wage earners struggled with rising prices. Inflation crept in, not from growth but from policy choices that worked at cross purposes. The wealth gap widened, and the cost of living outpaced wage growth for most Americans. Prosperity for a few, hidden taxes for the many. The economic divide deepened. The data is clear. The policies created winners and losers, and the losers were the majority. America's economic engine sputtered, split between Wall Street gains and Main Street pain. The world's grand bargain with America, goods for dollars, dollars for treasuries, is unraveling. Foreign central banks, once the bedrock of U.S. debt demand, are diversifying away from the dollar, wary of sanctions and political risk. BRICS nations and others are settling trade in local currencies, bypassing the dollar and chipping away at its dominance. Each non-dollar transaction weakens the currency's global privilege. For the U.S., this means higher borrowing costs and a shrinking pool of willing lenders. The Federal Reserve faces mounting pressure to stabilize a bond market abandoned by its former patrons. America can no longer count on the world to finance its deficits. The global financial system is moving on, and the U.S. must now confront the consequences of its own choices. The era of easy money from abroad is ending. For most Americans, global finance feels distant, until it isn't. Danny Yallo, a small manufacturer in Ohio, faced soaring costs from tariffs and rising interest rates. His business, squeezed by policy-driven inflation and expensive loans, couldn't survive. The closure of his factory rippled through the community. Lost jobs, shuttered stores, fading hope. Wealth concentration and a booming stock market meant nothing to towns like his. The pain was real, the consequences local. America's fiscal choices weren't just numbers, they were livelihoods lost and communities hollowed out. The crisis on Main Street is the true cost of living beyond our means. The U.S. Treasury bond market, once the world's safest, is now ground zero for a crisis of confidence. Rising yields signal growing risk, higher costs to borrow, ballooning interest payments, and a vicious cycle of debt. The government faces a stark choice: raise rates and risk recession, or print money and risk runaway inflation. The Federal Reserve is trapped, forced to consider emergency interventions that could further erode trust in the dollar. The prospect of the Fed as a permanent buyer of U.S. debt looms, a last resort that would confirm the worst fears of global investors. The bond market's message is clear: the current path is unsustainable. Without dramatic change, a fiscal reckoning is near. The world is watching and the stakes could not be higher. America's financial credibility hangs in the balance. The fireworks of July 4th once symbolized American independence and global leadership. Now, as the world diversifies away from the dollar, that independence looks more like isolation. The privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency has become a burden, exposing America's fiscal excesses. Foreign creditors are stepping back, leaving the U.S. to finance its deficits alone. Chronic inflation, currency debasement, and declining living standards loom. True independence requires a sustainable economy and sound governance, not just spectacle. America faces a choice: reform or risk standing alone in a world that has moved on. The era of unchallenged dominance is over. The future demands a new kind of responsibility.